Yes, I got a question about the Hamilton rule. It says genetic relatedness times benefit to others has to be greater than the cost of the altruism, right?
For altruism to evolve through kinship.
Can we break it down to a most fundamental situation in which you have that choice? I don't know. There's a train that has no rider and stuff like that, and then you have that how to call that lever that turns the train to the left or to the right.
Right, classic behavioral economics experiment, yes.
And then on one side it's your I don't know, your brother, and on the other side is your I don't know,
two of your cousins,
father, or somebody that has the same amount of genes or genetic relatedness, blah blah. And the cost and the benefit are actually constant, aren't they? So, what does the rule say about that?
Yeah, at the most basic level, when it comes to individuals that are relatives, and if they share the same genetic relatedness and everything else is constant, costs and benefits, then the theory predicts sort of indifference. There shouldn't be any. At the most basic level, if the genetic relatedness is the same and the costs and benefits are the same, there should be no preference to do one thing or the other. But it's almost never like that. And let me give you a good example. It's always more complicated than that. So for example, one study I didn't show you that I was going to, but I thought it was maybe a little too much, was a fellow by the name of David Buss, who studies evolution and psychology. And he did this experiment where he sort of set up what you're talking about, which was he had an experiment where the question was, how much help would you give to cousins? Okay, and all of the individuals involved in the experiment were cousins, but they were cousins in different ways, right? Because you can be cousins on your mother's side and you can be cousins on your father's side. Well, it turns out, like most good theory, that things are a little bit more complicated than the most basic form of the model. If you think about that problem, right? Women, so this was done with humans, okay? So you basically had someone come in and they were asked to make a decision about how much to help their cousins. Sometimes they were maternal cousins, sometimes they were cousins on the father's side, and so on. But there's something very basic that's different there, and that is that women, when they give birth to their children, know with 100% certainty that the baby they just gave birth to is their own. Men never know with that kind of certainty that the child that their mate or presumed mate just had is their own. What that means is that genetic relatedness that runs through male lineages is not as certain as genetic relatedness that runs through female lineages. When you ask people to help, they provide more assistance to the cousins on the female side of the family that run through female lineages than run through male lineages. So if everything is exactly the same, you would not predict any difference in behavior, but that's virtually never the case because there are always these little interesting subparts to it. I'll come back to you, but let me make sure I get to everybody else, if there's anybody else who has questions. Did I hear? Yeah, in the back.
We could exhibit people and animals showing altruism toward those to whom they are not related.
Right.
And also to those who may never be able to help them.
Yep.
Is there any hypothesis to explain these kinds of behavior?
Yeah. So the question is, what about the examples don't fall into any one of those two things that we talked about? So part of what I was saying when I said there's a lot more to be done is that there are plenty of those examples that we can't explain. But there are some other evolutionary explanations that I couldn't get into just because it would have taken too long. So for example, there's a whole nother model that gives you altruism that's called the group selection model. And the group selection model basically says that you can get altruism even among individuals who are not related and who will not be able to exchange, who do not exchange acts, if the cost that you pay for being an altruist is paid back because the group is more productive than other groups. So maybe it sends out more new founders, or maybe it's able to exploit the resources better than other groups. So if there's a benefit at the group level that makes up for the individual cost, then that's another way. That's a very controversial idea. I don't know how in the long run what's going to happen. That's one way. But there are plenty of examples where, there are examples where people will give to charity, but they'll only give in an anonymous way. So, typically you would think, well, the skeptical evolutionary biologists, when people give to charity and do things like that to help others, one skeptical way to think about that is, yeah, you end up giving $100 to this charity, and you didn't have to do that. But if other people know that you're the kind of person who helps others in need, then that gives you a reputation that in the long run might pay back the cost. Even if they don't give you $100 later, it may make you more attractive to the opposite sex. But there are still plenty of examples where we do not know what the evolutionary framework would be that would produce this kind of altruism. And we have people working on it, but that's what science is about. There are examples that we cannot explain, even by those two theories plus the third one I just said.
Any more questions?
What about voting in elections? In that case, you can also include some altruism, but it's not a finite answer. You can include altruism to try to determine why a person is going to the voting polls, but then the same principle doesn't give you an answer why this person chooses a certain political party.
So the question was about, can you apply these theories to questions about voting? It's a little bit far away from the literature I'm familiar with, but I guess the first thing that I would want to know is there any evidence or any way to think about what you do voting-wise as altruism before I would try and explain it from using theories of altruism? Certainly just the action of voting itself, I think most people would not say that that's altruistic. You vote because you want a certain outcome at the end. And so I don't think that voting per se would count. But I certainly think there are probably plenty of instances where you could make the argument that that people vote for a candidate who's not the candidate that will get them the most stuff, right? And you vote for somebody even if, in fact, we're in a voting cycle in the United States, and one of the candidates is a social democrat, and when you vote for, let's say you're in the middle class or higher, when you vote for that person, you essentially know that what you're doing is you're voting for someone who's going to distribute your resources to others. And you can make the argument that that's a kind of altruistic behavior. I bet you that there are people that are studying that from a psychological perspective, but I don't know the literature there very well at all. So I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what kind of explanations are out there for that. But you might ask Igor later, because he probably would know. Well, if anybody in the room would know, it would be him.
I have one question. Did amount of altruism through years change?
Does the amount of altruism through years change? In humans or just in general? There are studies that have looked at the development of altruism, and it kind of depends on the exact system you're looking at. So, for example, some kinds of altruism, they're hard, like for example, hunting cooperatively with others to bring down a large prey, right? That actually takes a lot of experience, and so you tend to see individuals be better at it and do more of it when they're older, simply because it's just something that takes a while to figure out. The other thing, though, is that we would generally predict that the older individuals get, the more likely you would see altruism dispensed to their relatives. And the extreme example of this would be, in humans, we would expect that females who have reached menopause and who are not going to reproduce themselves anymore would tend to be the most altruistic category, simply because that's the only other way that you can help your relatives, would be because if you're not going to produce any more kids. So there's a whole sort of grandmothering hypothesis out there about the evolution of altruism, about why is it that you see older menopausal women displaying lots of altruism to their relatives, but it's simply, there's no more direct reproduction, so you expect there to be more indirect reproduction through your relatives. And that's also been demonstrated in non-humans. Not as much, but some. Did I get you before or no? Did I?
Yeah.
Okay, then let me make sure I get everybody at least once. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did the researcher always use the rats that were familiar to each other, or they tried with the ones that didn't know each other?
Yeah, the question was, in the rat experiment, did they always use individuals who had lived together for 2 weeks? And the answer is yes. I can imagine why you might want to set up an experiment where they didn't for a while, just to sort of see what effect that had on the outcome. So you have to kind of know an individual for a certain amount of time. But they didn't do it. My guess is they didn't do it because they wanted to get to the point where all of the initial exploration of each other that happens when rats first come together was done, and they sort of were where it would be more likely to get some kind of empathy. You would expect empathy most often when you have individuals who know each other. Now, you might get it even with individuals who don't know each other, but I don't think they didn't do that experiment. But you could.
When you mentioned the rat experiment with the contraption, when you're a geneticist, you obviously need to find something that should be worked upon during the evolution, so the empathy should evolve. So
right.
Those things should be genes, of course. Evolution works on individuals. Group selection is a very, very problematic thing. But can you imagine the experiment with these rats? Like you do it with 3,000 rats. Mm. And eventually you find not in the same cage.
Right.
Eventually you find a rat that doesn't do this empathy.
Right, sure.
Then you can cross them.
Right.
Then you can see the thing.
Right. So you could.
That would be the control experiment and the real biological experiment.
Well, I don't know if I would say that's the only real biological experiment. So because first of all, you wouldn't do that experiment unless you did this experiment. Okay, but that would give you, that would allow you to understand something fundamental from an evolutionary perspective, which is the genetic variance, the underlying genetic variance that's driving this trait. I agree with you completely. It's possible that it wouldn't shock me if some of this behavior is learned, but nonetheless, I would imagine that if you tested enough animals, you would be able to do the kind of experiment that you're talking about, and it would be a great experiment. The thing about the empathy and the injustice is that it's just so early in the history of these kind of studies. Like I said, these are two of the very few studies that I know on this. So, but in the long run, rats would be perfect because people do that every day for rats, for everything. So it should be something that you could do. Absolutely.
The other thing, if I may, the squirrel experiments, when obviously we see that the females are much more free-giving.
Right.
They like to sacrifice themselves for the group.
For their relatives, yes. Right.
See at least one other alternative explanation. Because male in these animals, and whatever, animals that have internal ovulation and internal copulation, the male is a clearly absolute source of biodiversity. So if you spend one male, it would be like spending 3,000 females, because all the biodiversity in these kind of animals comes from the male.
Why do you say that? I'm sorry, I don't.
Because they have very limited number of egg cells, and sperm is unlimited. So all that biodiversity, it should come the testicles.
Well,
So
that,
now-
that makes the females even more valuable. And if you look
No,
at
no,
human
I-
behavior,
no.
you see the women are less prone to, let's say, aggressive acts and any kind of extreme behavior because they're guarding their resources.
But you're talking about.
Follow.
Yeah, I understand. You're going to say you're basically saying here that from the perspective of maximizing genetic diversity in the group, that you would expect males to do that less if for example, group selection was in play.
I mean, what I was going to say is simple. If you let males on the line, if you have males on the line, you're just jeopardizing your biodiversity. If you have females on the line, you're not jeopardizing biodiversity that much.
I guess I.
I mean, come on, but this scenario is very plausible evolutionary. So if you're trying to protect the system that gives the biodiversity.
But
This is a plausible evolution scenario. This is obvious alternative.
I guess maybe we should talk about this more because I still don't see the argument. I think it's I think there's but let's talk about that a little bit afterwards. Okay. Yeah. In the back, yes.
What is your opinion on example you have a situation where you have two human beings, only them, there's nobody around to see the act. One person saves the other's life for the cost of their own. And why would they do that? Is maybe the reason why our goodness is so evolved because we get a positive feeling from helping others.
Oh, okay. All right. So, So I can try and answer part of that question. So, any given act of altruism, it's not like evolutionary theory is meant to explain any specific one case of two individuals and all that. But I think that when I said that we don't use intent and that sort of thing in our definition of altruism, I said you simply help somebody, you help others at a cost to yourself. But I didn't mean to suggest that there aren't benefits that you might get emotionally from helping others. So in general, what I would think is that there absolutely are these benefits that are hormonally derived benefits. So for example, we know that when you help individuals, your oxytocin levels increase. You also tend to help more when you have high oxytocin in the first place, but it increases after you've helped somebody. And there are a number of hormones like that, and things like stress hormones decrease. So good things happen hormonally. And we know that, the ratio of good hormones in the sense of things that increase your survival to decreasing your survival, there's no question that those things are impacted positively by you helping others. So I think that is a real benefit that exists in humans. That's a difficult, as far as I know, there's not a lot of work that's tried to measure what that benefit might be. But I think it's real. As an evolutionary biologist, I would then ask, okay, let's try and understand why in the world it should be the case that your stress hormones go down and your good feeling hormones go up when you help somebody else. In other words, if that's an evolved response, why has that response evolved? And then I might turn to some of the theories we talked about already, and maybe there are other theories out there that need to be developed. So I think what you're saying is a real part of what goes on in human altruism, but we don't know sort of the real costs and benefits of it, and we don't really have sort of a good theory for to answer the question, why do we have those kinds of responses, sort of brings you back to where we started, which is what are the evolutionary benefits of helping somebody? I mean, why should you feel good? I mean, there must be some benefit that you're receiving to have favored feeling good when you help somebody. At least that's one hypothesis.
It's related to the last thing you just said. In some cases, in some scenarios, the alpha males provide food to other group members in order to establish their dominance.
Right.
To display it.
Right.
So it might be related to the feeling of superiority when you, take resources of your own and provide them to other members.
Right, and there's definitely a real literature on the evolution of reputation. And that's sort of what we're talking about here. The reputation that you build up as somebody who dispenses resources to others in your population, it's definitely a costly thing to do. I mean, you could keep them for yourself, but you give them out, and that gives you the reputation in the group as somebody who, in humans in particular, is someone who can be counted on and trusted and who does good things, and that probably has all sorts of positive effects on you. They're going to be really indirect and hard to measure, but I would guess that those things are real. Plus, there's the other side of it is that might explain why, for example, those individuals. So if you're somebody who's like high in the hierarchy, and you in fact are someone who gives out food to others in the group, there might be selection pressures among all the individuals in the group that individual should be protected because they're doing this stuff that helps everybody. So you might expect them not to necessarily give the alarm calls and others to do the alarm calls because they're doing something else, which is dispensing the resources. And there's some evidence in non-humans too that of this kind of translation of currencies, this notion that we tend to think about when we exchange acts of goodness, we tend to think about it as being, I give you a blood meal, you give me a blood meal. But in all likelihood, it's much more likely the case that I give you something and you give me something back, but it's not the same thing. So I might protect you from a predator, and maybe you give me a piece of food. Those things again become just harder to study because you really, really, really have to understand the natural history of the animals. Otherwise, you wouldn't even sort of know where to look for what they're exchanging. But it can be done. All right, well, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.